Hi everyone, thank you for the introduction. I'm sorry I'm not there with you today because it looks like a fantastic event and I'm sure you're going to have some very interesting discussions as the day progresses. I want to start my presentation by looking at factors which led to the uprising in Syria, which, as you know, was inspired by this huge revolutionary wave that was taking place across the region. And the two factors which caused people to take to the streets was political repression and the policies of economic neoliberalism. And I want to mention them briefly because I think it's very important to understand which people have been at the core of the grassroots civil resistance and why. In terms of political repression, Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970 and he ruled for 40 years. Under his rule, a leadership cult was formed and Syria became a totalitarian police state where there was mass persecution of political dissidents. When Hafez died in the year 2000, his son Bashar inherited the dictatorship. Now, Bashar was originally seen as a reformist and there was a climate of optimism when he came to power. But in effect, very little changed from his father's rule in terms of political freedoms. Restrictions remained in place on the formation of political parties and civil organisations, and emergency law remained in place as it has done since 1963. And what emergency law meant was that in effect all the constitutional rights of citizens were suspended and the security forces were empowered. Now, under Bashar's rule, and I witnessed this very much during the years that I worked as a human rights activist, we saw widespread persecution of both political activists and human rights activists. Common human rights abuses included arbitrary detentions, torture, extrajudicial executions, and widespread enforced disappearances. The Kurdish citizens of Syria, which were about 9% of the population, were denied many of their political rights as well as their economic, social and cultural rights. And we also had massive restrictions on both internet and press freedoms. Looking at the second factor, when Bashar came to power, he introduced wide-ranging neoliberal economic reforms. And these included the privatisation of state farms, the introduction of a private banking system, the promotion of private sector-led investment, and a reduction in subsidies. But these reforms were not accompanied by policies to redistribute wealth or ensure social protection. And what we saw in those 10 years was a wide growth of inequality between rich and poor, and also an exacerbation of the rural and urban divide. Both Assad loyalists and the business class benefited from these policies. Bashar's inner circle, including his family and members from the Alawi sect to which he belonged, became very wealthy. For example, it's estimated that Rami Makhlouf, who's the cousin of the president, controlled about 60% of the Syrian economy through his business interests. But it's important to note that it wasn't only the Alawi members of the Alawi sect that benefited, because also the Sunni and Christian bourgeoisie benefited from these policies as the regime attempted to build economic ties with individuals from different communities in an attempt to ensure their loyalty. But at the same time, the poor were disenfranchised, the cost of living rose. And Syrians living under the poverty line increased from 11% in the year 2000, which was when Bashar came to power, to 34.5% in 2010. And we're talking around 7 million people. In rural areas, this stood at 62%. Unemployment rates were very high, especially for the youth, which is the majority of the Syrian population, who really lacked job opportunities. For those living in rural areas, this was exacerbated by years of consecutive drought, partly due to natural factors and partly due to resource mismanagement, which led to the depopulation of many villages as people flooded to the city looking for better opportunities and a means to ensure their livelihood. Now, this is important to note because when the uprising starts, what we see is that it starts in rural areas and economically disenfranchised cities. The core of the grassroots civil opposition is the youth, mainly from the working and middle classes. And within the grassroots civil opposition, we see that women play a major part, and also people from Syria's diverse religious and ethnic communities. Many of these activists remain non-affiliated to traditional political ideology, but are instead very much motivated by concerns for freedom, dignity, and human rights. The main form of revolutionary organisation in Syria has been very much at the local level, through the work of the local committees and local councils. These were influenced by the work of Syrian anarchist Omar Aziz. Aziz argued that it is inconsistent for revolutionaries to participate in protests by day and then to return to living within the hierarchical and authoritarian structures imposed by the state. What he believed was that revolutionary activity should permeate all aspects of life, and he advocated for radical changes to social relationships and organisation. He called for autonomous, non-hierarchical organisation and self-governance based on principles of cooperation, solidarity and mutual aid. And together with comrades, he founded the first local committee, which was in Bazeh in Damascus. Today, what we've seen is the establishment of hundreds of local committees in neighbourhoods and towns throughout the country. In these committees, revolutionary activists engage in a number of activities. They document and report on violations carried out by the regime and increasingly by elements of the armed opposition. They also organise protests and civil disobedience campaigns, such as strikes and refusing to pay utility bills. They also collect and provide aid and humanitarian supplies to areas which are under bombardment or siege. They operate as horizontally organised legalist groups that are made up of all segments of society. Whilst they're primarily organising on the local level, what we've also seen is them building up networks of solidarity and mutual aid across the country. And there's a number of different umbrella groups that have emerged to coordinate and network on both the regional and national levels. These include the local coordination committees, and I mention the local coordination committees because it's probably one of the most well known, as it does a lot of the media work and the international outreach. At the city and district levels, what we've seen is the establishment of local councils, and there's around 128, 130 throughout Syria. Now, these act as the primary civil administrative structure in areas which have been liberated from the state. They ensure the provision of basic services, such as water and electricity supply, education, garbage disposal. They also coordinate with the local committees and coordinate with armed resistance groups to maintain security. They're often made up of civilians that participated in demonstrations, as well as people that are selected for both their technical and professional abilities. And many of these people come from the middle classes, in contrast to the formal opposition in exile, which is comprised mainly of people from richer families, which somewhat explains the tension between these two groups and lack of outside support. These local councils mainly follow some form of representative democratic model, and what we've seen is free local elections occurring in areas where they've been established, something that's not happened in Syria under 4 decades of Ba'ath rule. But the local councils face many challenges, and this includes the scarcity of resources, as very little aid has come from outside, which obviously hinders them in being able to carry out their functions and provide for the civilian population. In some areas, councils have also struggled to maintain independence from armed groups, and in areas where militant jihadi groups such as ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra are strong, such as parts of northern Syria, that they've tried to set up parallel institutions such as Islamic courts. And where this has happened, what we've really seen is very strong opposition from the civilian population, from the people populations who've organised regular protests against them. Finally, I'd just like to give a brief overview of some of the revolutionary groupings active in Syria, and I'm just going to mention three. The first one I'd like to mention is the Syrian Revolutionary Youth Coalition, and these were established in May 2012. They're leftists, but they're not affiliated to any political party, and they focus their activity both on promoting the political goals of the revolution, which is the desire for freedom, with the socio-economic goals, which is the desire for social justice. They organise throughout the country, but we see that they're most active and their main presence is in Damascus and Homs, and they organise some very daring protests in Damascus, with areas still under regime control. Another group I'd like to mention is the Union of Free Syrian Students, established in September 2011. And this group organised protests on universities and campuses throughout the country. They distribute information, and they founded their own magazine called The Voice of the Free. They document human rights violations carried out against students, and they campaign for the release of student detainees. They've also participated in many nationwide campaigns, such as the campaigns in solidarity with female prisoners at Adra prison who went on hunger strike in July earlier this year to protest the conditions of their detention. Finally, I'd like to mention the Kurdish youth movement, the TCK. This movement was actually established prior to the revolution in 2005, following the Kurdish uprising the previous year, in which many were killed and more than 2,000 Kurds were arrested by state security services. The TCK advocates for human rights and justice for Kurds and for a federal solution for Syria's Kurdish population. It's played an active role in anti-regime protests since the first days of the uprising. But recently, we've also seen them organising demonstrations against the Democratic Union Party, the PYD, which is now the main party in control of Kurdish areas, in protest against the PYD's authoritarian policies, including the arrest of Kurdish youth activists and activists from political opposition groups. From much of the Western media, what we've seen is a focus in discussions on militarization, Islamization, and sectarianism. But I hope that my presentation today and subsequent presentations will show you that the grassroots civil resistance is still very much alive in spite of the enormous challenges it faces. There's still a revolution worth supporting in Syria, and it's very much deserving of international solidarity. Thank you.